Hello and welcome everyone to this course on women and gender dynamics in Indonesia. I am Dr. Yuyun Sriwahyuni and together we will explore the intersectionalities of gender, sustainability, religion, and indigenous agency within the Indonesian context. This lecture is part of the broader conversation on polycrisis and resilience, a summer school collaboration between Western Sydney University with Yogyakarta State University. This lecture aims to explore the intersectionality of gender, sustainability, and religious, also indigenous women's agency in Indonesia, as the title indicate. And in this lecture, we'll engage with various feminist frameworks to understand how international development intersects with local gender experiences. The goal of this course is to critically analyze Indonesian gender dynamics and explore how women-led reforms can foster sustainability amid global and local challenges. The first question that you may ask in this lecture is why Indonesia? Why Indonesia plays significant roles to understand the dynamics of gender within sustainability contexts and also within polycrisis development. Well, Indonesia is home to a rich tapestry of religious, cultural, and modern influences. So, to understand the intersectionality of these social structures, we can understand what contributes and what constructs women's experiences and lived realities. Other than this reason, women in Southeast Asia have long histories of agency, particularly in religious and indigenous communities. Despite this long history, however, post-colonial legacies, neoliberalism, populism, and neoconservatism that developed very rapidly in Indonesia today, especially neoliberalism and populism, including neoconservative ideas, continue to shape women's lived realities. Understanding these tensions is crucial for us for imagining more inclusive and more sustainable future. When we speak about gender in Indonesian history, it is crucial to challenge a common assumption that women in the past Indonesia were uniformly oppressed or relegated to the domestic spheres. In fact, pre-colonial Indonesian societies often featured relatively egalitarian gender relations, particularly when compared to the rigid patriarchal norms introduced later during colonialism. In many pre-Islamic and early Islamic societies in the archipelago, gender roles were defined more by cooperation and complementarity than strict divisions. Women's labor was visible and valuable across both public and private spheres. They engaged also in trade, agriculture, healing practices, religious rituals, and even political leadership. A powerful illustration of this gender dynamic is Admiral Malahayati, or who is famous with Kamala Hayati. She is often recognized as the first woman admiral in the modern world, and she led a navy of widows in Aceh in the late 16th century and fought against the Dutch and Portuguese colonial forces. However, this gender order shifted dramatically under colonial rule. The Dutch colonial administration systematically introduced patriarchal structures codified in law, education, and also bureaucracy. To make it worse, this shift intersected with the politics of Islamic lawmaking. This history in Indonesia is also resonates with Iza Hussein's arguments in her book, The Politics of Islamic Law. She argues that colonial administrators and local elites negotiated Islamic laws in ways that often reified patriarchal interpretations of Sharia for state control, sidelining indigenous and existing Muslim legal pluralisms and women's rights. Accordingly, after independence, these historical complexities resulted in mixed outcomes. Institutional support for women's rights in some areas, but also the persistence of colonial and patriarchal structures in law, religion, and society. This slide builds directly on our previous discussion. While colonial legacies and post-independence politics created a mixed record, recent data shows both progresses and persistent challenges. According to the 2024 Gender Inequalities Index in Indonesia, Indonesia's score dropped by 0.026, signaling improvements in women's access to education, reproductive health care, and political participations. However, deeper analysis reveals ongoing inequalities that women face in their lives. Only 30% of STEM professionals are women, for example. Another thing, women earn 23% less than men on average, despite they're doing the very same jobs. And 1 in 3 women experiences gender-based violence in her lifetime. Of course, this is a very bad number that we see here. So, while indicators show progress, structural barriers remain deeply embedded. This compels us to think critically about how data-driven development must be grounded in local intersectional understandings of gender. The persistent inequalities and also injustices that women face, as we discussed in the previous slide, bring us to further questions of whether our global policy of SDGs is adequate. Other than that, we also should ask, how do we translate global framework of SDGs onto local particularities? And the other way around, what can we learn from each woman with various complex temporal gender order for more effective policies? So we can tackle better how to achieve gender equality in the future. As it is indicated here, the data from the UN Women, we know that the world is not on track to achieve gender equality. So we need to rethink, reanalyze how is the formulation of these global policies meet women's need. To grasp the gendered landscape of Indonesia today that accentuate the global policy of SDGs implementation, we must situate it within what scholars now call as a polycrisis situation, a term that refers to multiple overlapping and mutually reinforcing crises. These include climate collapse, neoliberal economic restructuring, populist politics, religious conservatism, digital surveillance, and also the erosions of democratic institutions that we see worldwide. Unlike a single issue crisis that can be addressed through linear solutions, polycrisis creates entangled conditions that cannot be understood in isolation. For example, environmental degradation isn't merely an ecological concern, as I will also show you in the next coming slides. It is also deeply gendered, affecting women's access to land, labor, health, food, and survival. Similarly, religious revivalism is not just about faith. It intersects with political identity, class, and also gender control. To make sense of this complexity, we turn to Jasper Puar's concept of intersectional assemblage. This theory moves beyond additive models of identity, for example, race plus gender plus class, and instead it tries to understand power and identity as produced through interlocking systems of force, material conditions, affect, and temporality. It further develops the idea of intersectionality coined by Crenshaw, and it is also developing the theory of assemblage. This theoretical development invites us to see how bodies, institutions, and narratives are dynamically shaped within ever-shifting relations of domination and resistance. In my work, I further develop intersectional assemblage lens through what I propose as Decolonial Transnational Islamic Feminism, or DTIF. DTIF expands intersectional assemblage not only as an analytical tool but also as a feminist theoretical trajectory. DTIF builds upon also different post-colonial and decolonial feminist scholarship, especially on their critiques on Western feminism that universalizes women's gendered experiences, and also inserting the ideas that women of color, including Muslim women, are inherently oppressed by their culture and religion. However, I go beyond their critique by articulating transnational political ethics. DTIF transnationalism is not limited to recognizing global interconnectivity, including in women's and gender activism. It deeply criticized dominant global political and economic systems such as neoliberalism, developmentalism, and imperial militarism, which often frame women's empowerment in terms of capitalist productivity or Western imperialist agenda. At the same time, the DTIF proposes a counter-hegemonic vision of global alliance grounded in the ethics of justice, mutual dignity, and solidarity across civilization. The DTIF serves as a bridge between the North and South, academic and grassroots, and enrich differences and uniqueness among different communities. The DTIF thus brings together three interrelated commitments: decoloniality, transnationalism, and also Islamic feminism, in which altogether the DTIF challenge gendered colonial legacies embedded in law, religion, culture, and also in scientific epistemology. And it is also a critique of global systems of domination and platform at the same time for building ethical alliances across cultural borders. And in Islamic feminism, it reclaims interpretive authority and promotes gender justice rooted in Islamic epistemology. It brings the idea that long historical trajectory of political, colonial, and also Islamic law, the politics of Islamic lawmaking needs to be reinterpreted to, to bring women back to their dignity and also authority. Therefore, when we speak of sustainability in Indonesia, we cannot reduce it to technocratic or policy goals per se. Sustainability is an intersectional struggle where ecological justice is, let's say, ecological justice, and we also need different other justices, right, as inseparable from gender justice: spiritual renewal, indigenous sovereignty, and also decolonial knowledge production. And finally, in this slide, understanding polycrisis through DTIF enables us to reframe Indonesian women's responses not as isolated acts of resistance, but as multi-layered interventions in complex systems of power. These interventions are including ecological, theological, emotional, economic, and also above all deeply political. You can name it, and we can bring different other interventions that could promote sustainability in our world today. Let's move now from our theory discussion to the conversation of cases. The first cases that we are talking about now is the religious agency among Indonesian women. In our examination of gender justice and religious authority, indicating women's agency, the work of KUPI or Kongres Ulama Perempuan Indonesia, in English, Indonesian Women's Ulama Congress, stands out as a transformative force. This network of women ulama has issued gender-responsive fatwas on different urgent issues such as child marriage, sexual and domestic violence, female genital mutilations, which they considered haram, and that is really powerful in subverting the patriarchal traditional scholars among different Muslim communities in Indonesia, and they also has their fatwas on environmental destruction. In these problems, they frame that it is not only as legal or social problems, but also as profound moral and theological concerns. And in their activism and their fatwa making, KUPI draws from Rahmatan lil Alamin approach and combined it with Mubadalah or mutual reciprocity among gender. And they use these tools to interpret and reinterpret Islamic theological values and principles on different problems. KUPI not only legitimizes women's authority in religious discourses, but they also build institutional support by training other younger women to be Muslim community leaders through pesantren partnership and also different community organizing. Another powerful narratives of Indonesian woman agency, especially on religious agency, comes from the 2025 book Sekolahlah Tinggi-Tinggi, Perjalanan Perempuan Mengejar Cita Keempat Benua, published by Gramedia. This book that I wrote with some other 13 Indonesian women pursuing PhD abroad reflect our struggles and also triumphs in navigating gendered expectations and also structural barriers to achieve our dream and desires. Through education, mobility, and also our narrations, we subvert traditional social scripts and we attempt to construct new meanings of gender, womanhood, motherhood, and also scholarship among women in Indonesia. This book, as we believe it, functions as a counter narrative challenging assumptions about Indonesian Muslim women. Together, this book and KUPI examples illustrate how women's agency in Indonesia is not monolithic. It moves through religious spaces, academic institutions, cultural narratives, and everyday acts of resilience. And altogether, these narrations urge us to think of gender justice not just as a matter of law or policy, but also as a lived, evolving struggle for women's dignity, voices, and narrations. We have discussed religious agency among Indonesian women in the previous slide. Now we move to women's indigenous agency through their environmental and sustainability struggle. In Central Java, the Kendeng women farmers are resisting cement mining that threatens their land and water. As you see in these figures in this slide, their protests, including the now iconic 2016 feet in cement actions, illustrates how environmental justice and gender justice are deeply linked. Their famous slogan, Ibu Bumi Wes Maringi, Ibu Bumi Dilarani, and Ibu Bumi Bakal Ngundang Balani, speaks to the sacredness of the earth as a maternal figure. This slogan means the Mother Earth has provided, the Mother Earth is being heard, and then the Mother Earth will eventually send her disasters to human. This discussion of women and environment also resonates with the concerns of feminist ecologies, in which they argue that environmental destructions affect deeply on women's well-being and life. Our discussion in this slide is on women's economic agency within structural precarity in Kauman, Yogyakarta. Kauman, Yogyakarta is an area that is historically linked to early development of Islam and also center for Islamic learning in area surrounding Kraton, and it is also a cultural heritage until today. In this place, women have played a central role in sustaining both the local economy and community resilience for generations. The women in Kauman are well known for their leadership in home batik industry, which dates back to at least the 19th century. These batik maker women, these women batik maker are not merely artisans, they are entrepreneurs, educators, religious patrons, and also breadwinners. Their workshops function as both productive and reproductive spaces in which they earn income for their household, fund children's education, and contribute to religious charities and social cohesion. In many families, it is the woman, not the men, who carry the economic weight. Most of men in these families are abdi dalam. The women in Kauman have maintained matrilineal systems of knowledge transmission, teaching daughters and women apprentices the art and businesses of batik. So their workshop have also evolved into intergenerational skill sharing among women and also economic solidarity. However, despite this clear contribution to the local economy, their labor, like many women's small-scale or home-based industry across the global south, is largely classified as informal, so that often their situation reflect what we know as lack of formal recognition, social protection, and also economic security. This condition highlights a persistent paradox in gender and development discourse, that is, women's labor is vital, yet they are often undervalued. Let's now close our lecture on Indonesian women's agencies with some questions for reflection. First, in what ways do women's grassroots movements in Indonesia could challenge or complement global feminist and sustainability discourse? And then, how can we decolonize gender equality frameworks in ways that center Indigenous and religious women's lived realities? What can DTIF offer in rethinking this global framework of sustainability? And finally, which I think very crucial today, how can we build more sustainable feminist futures in the midst of multiple crises, including environmental, political, economic, and spiritual? And that's all for our lecture. Thank you very much.